image is, right? Image in humanity, right? What is that human image in humanity? That's what we're going to come back to. Myth versus what? Oftentimes myth is seen as what kind of word, especially when it's applied to the biblical text? Is it acceptable?
A lot of people think it means not true.
Good. So we often set myth side by side or contrast it with what else? What? Truth, sure.
Isn't there now kind of an idea? I watched a lot of shows on TV that in all myths, not just Christianity, there's always a kernel of truth. No matter how preposterous it seems, when they start looking at it in a historical perspective, they find that there were these happenings, and it wasn't just a made up story usually. There was something there that made people think. There was a truth nugget.
Good. So this is the misconception, right? When we talk about myth, we think sometimes, especially in the church, I think, we think untruth and history as truth, right?
Yeah.
Fact, we can put our finger on it. But you're exactly right, Susan, right? I'm getting names down, is that right, Susan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see how people would come to this conclusion,
Right.
once you studied history.
So there is truth in myth. So what's the difference between the truth in myth and the truth in history?
Chance versus intention.
The way it's presented, the wording.
Well,
And then the truth is put into a story that allows us to hang on to the key items more than just historical facts.
Yeah. Narrative, right, yeah.
That's exactly right. We might even talk about, and there's an overlap between these, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, every presentation of history contains myth, contains perception, but when we're talking about the category of scientific history, which is developed by the modern Western world, right? We're talking about what kind of facts? More objective facts, yes?
observable.
Observable, that's exactly right. Which are good. Objectivity is a reality. There are some people who say that nothing is really real, right? There's no objectivity. Gravity is objective, right? So, this kind of narrative truth that's embedded within myth, or what? What's the other side of objectivity?
Subject.
Yeah. What's the most important holiday in the calendar?
For us, Easter.
Easter.
I mean, that's okay.
What?
More important than Easter. Anyone?
Christmas.
The presents are nice, but I'm,
That's right. He's really fishing for us.
I'm really fishing for it. I know you don't know who Bo knows. Valentine's Day. What has Bo taught you?
Oh,
Come on. It's Valentine's Day, right? Jeez.
We don't celebrate those.
You don't?
No, none of us.
but you better.
I'm out.
No.
Okay, I'm going to recite for you a poem that I've been working on for my beloved, all right? And you tell me if it's
You have until
acceptable or not.
February, so.
I know, I'm working hard. You can steal it if you want. You ready?
Roses are, no.
Dear fill in the blank, right? You are 5 feet 8 inches tall. You have shoulder length hair. You have 2 eyes, mouth with a full set of teeth. You have 10 fingers and 10 toes. I love you.
Descriptive.
Wasn't that beautiful?
You
Yeah.
didn't tell us the color of her hair though.
I should have.
Or does it change like today?
Why is that an unacceptable, romantic, poetic statement?
It is factual.
It is
Yeah, it's
factual.
objective, factual, but it's
Lacks emotion.
emotions.
Lacks emotion.
I think descriptive or even practical can be juxtaposed with normative. That is, the norm, there's some judgment or value placed on whatever is being said.
Certainly.
And and I think those are 2 or 3 different ways to think of each text. This is a descriptive judgment, but this is purporting to give this information a sense of norm, a sense of value.
Yes, right, absolutely, absolutely. And at the same time, because these 2 texts are set side by side with one another and they conflict with one another, we understand that the author is not intending to give us a history of what happened at the beginning of time, right? The authors know this. They know that these are these conflicts. They know that it doesn't make sense objectively, historically, in those terms, right? And so this is more of a subjective narrative myth in the best sense of the word, right? That is offering a truth that goes far beyond what I just said about my beloved, right? Because that could be applied to many, many people. But the poet has to depend upon metaphor, simile, and parallelism, because he or she knows that every time I try to categorize the beloved, I fall short, right? And so I say, you are like this, and yet you can't be contained in that. So you're also like this, and yet you can't be contained in that, and you are also like this, and on and on and on, right? At a loss for words. And so this, I think this is what we have to, how we should, to my mind, approach Genesis 1 through 3 as this attempt to articulate a deeper understanding of what God intended for humanity and how God designed humanity. Does that follow? Does that make sense? Because too often in the church, we get stuck on, is it historical? And it just doesn't work out historically. In fact, it wasn't until day 4, I believe it was day 4, that God created the sun.
Always light,
Yes, there's light,
but not sunlight.
but not sun. And yet you have day 1, day 2, day 3 without the sun, which is the marker of the day, right? Yes, they knew this.
How was your book, which described, just a couple of years in your life of your family, how was that somehow beyond just descriptive, factual? Because it was. I mean, it was entertaining.
Mhm.
And what made that story more deep and more human and more universal?
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that.
She taught a couple of weeks ago in here.
Oh, awesome, that's great.
So several years ago, I decided it was time for me to do something for my grandchildren. I have 6 of them, and they've become a big presence in my life. And I said, what is their life like, and what can I contribute to that? Knowing that I stand between my father, my grandparents, all of those folks that I know something about, and my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren who are not here yet. But I stand in between all those folks. So how can I make that link? And part of the way I did it was I was writing about ancestors, our ancestors, and there were some good stories. I thought the stories needed to be told. I already had the facts. I have a nice big, really chucky full of facts, kind of a genealogy, but I wanted them to be able to identify. And I think that's what you're saying, that
Feel the
to
fact.
feel it, to understand something of the people. And so I drew upon, okay, what do I know about my father and my grandfather and great-grandfather and my grandmother and my great-grandmother and all those. What do I know about them? And what do I know about the people I know and I grew up with? And I can sort of reflect back in time those qualities that I have encountered in some ways. And so that's what I think gives it a little life.
Yeah.
That I'm writing from something I know.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, and you can identify as a reader and a person in the story, and that's the key.
But our grandson asked the question, Grandma, what's real and what's not real? And we're doing the same thing. What's real and what's not
That's
real?
right.
Yes,
You know.
and my response to him was to put a little section in the back of the book. And I listed the events
That's
that were
funny.
real.
Yeah. And yet the emotion, the feeling, the perception is just as real as the
Yes,
events, yeah.
yes.
And so creation in 7 days or 6 days, rest on 7, is that good? No, it's the structure, it's the presentation of nature being ordered in a certain way and God being intentional behind that and God being this transcendent being who's able to call reality into being simply by speaking it. If you contrast it with the Babylonian narrative, creation narrative, the new hellish, it's chaotic, there's bloodshed, there's struggle, right? And many think that the Genesis 1 was written during the Babylonian exile. And it's a piece of subversive literature to the Jews in exile who are, they lost their homeland, they've lost their God, essentially, they've lost their people. And any betting person would say, I'm going to become a Babylonian. And the authors of Genesis 1 say, okay, you have a choice. You can either be part of this divine family or this one. One where you're created for slavery in Babylon, or one where you're created in the image of God and blessed to be good.
Get to the image of God, because
Got it.
I was really hoping that I could get a view from you on how this all makes us Imago Dei.
Good. Rachel, would you mind hitting about 2 slides up? I think. There you go. That's the text. Can't read it very well, but first I'd ask, how has the Imago Dei, the image of God, been defined for you, or how have you perceived it in the past? And let me be clear on this. There are different readings, right? I'm going to present my perception of it that I think fits with the second narrative, Genesis 2 and 3, and then the flood narrative. But what's been promoted historically, whether you believe it or buy into it or not? There's one interpretation, there's one definition that has dominated Christian theology since the beginning of Christian tradition. Yeah. It's picked up by as early as Origen, and Augustine embraces it. Thomas embraces it, and it continues to impact, though it has it makes sense, actually. It makes sense. What sets humanity apart from the animals?
The ability to think.
Yep.
The freedom to choose. And that we too create.
Okay, good. That's good.
Don't forget the emotion to love.
I'm going to summarize much of what you said, Bill. It's human reason, yeah? This is picked up. And the image is identified as this in humanity. And again, as I said, that makes sense. The problem is, and we can go through this if we want to in the future, the problem is this is a very Greek concept. Plato and Aristotle defined humanity as that which has reason. And this is picked up by Origen. Origen had a love affair with Plato and Augustine. And Rachel, if you can push to, what this did was, it resulted in, go ahead, 1, 2 more. It resulted, we can go through this if you'd like, 1 more, thanks. two things: the subordination of women, because according to Aristotle and Plato, or Aristotle in particular, women had a deficiency in their capacity to reason, yes, and thus they should be subordinate to men. And then it also results in the subjugation of the other, because according to Aristotle, there were natural born slaves who also had a deficiency in human reason and therefore had to be under the authority of a master. And the Christian church picked this up. And for ages, women were not allowed to be leaders in the church. Still, that's the case in some congregations. And this very philosophy was used to enslave people, specifically in this country and in the South. And there was a preacher in the First Presbyterian Church of New Orleans before and during and after the Civil War, who, if you look at his sermons, are point by point Aristotelian in nature. And he says it is God's design for the South to maintain slavery, because if we do not, these individuals who are irrational will go wild and it will be bad for them. Yeah? Augustine says On the Trinity, only men were created in the image of God, because only men have the full capacity to reason. All that women are not created in the image of God. That's our heritage. So I want to return. And so Rachel, if you go maybe one slide forward, thank you. Let's think about, I think, Bill and Eustace, right? Euless, sorry, Euless,
And
my
you
fault.
give-
Eustace.
Useless is the best one. Got it.
No, Euless, you said love, right?
Emotion.
Emotion. You said creativity. Think about the text, right? What's strange about the text, especially that first line? And I'm going to build on the theologies of Bonhoeffer and Emil Brunner and a few others to kind of reconsider what the divine image might be, peeling off the Greek philosophical tradition that I think has done a disservice to the text. Does that follow?
Yeah.
These are some of our presuppositions, the lenses with which we approach the Bible. Too often the Greek philosophy is sullied.
Bonhoeffer. And who?
Brunner, Emil Brunner, Martin Buber.
Yeah. And I think there's a Jewishness to
Oh yeah,
that view that doesn't get Greek Hellenized
that's exactly right.
for a while. You know, if you just stick with Judaism, it's more core ideas and nefesh and stuff.
Jesus was a Jew, right? The Hebrew Bible was his sacred text. He thought in those terms. He was not influenced by Greek philosophy in the same way that then what become known as the church fathers.
So except for Bonhoeffer, we're talking Brunner and you just said
Buber, yeah. Buber.
Yeah,
So this is what Bonhoeffer says. First thing, is God compelled to create? Is God compelled to create by anything? And if you're familiar with the Enneagram Analysis, you might think about that, because there's compulsion there, there's necessity.
Isn't that a personal decision?
Yeah, it is. And so Bonhoeffer says the creator, God, is inherently free, yes? Creator is inherently free, and if the creation is to be like the creator, it too must be free. We were talking about intention before, right? Free will. God instills, or part of the divine image is freedom. Does that follow? Is that fair?
Yeah. Stripping the Greek away.
That's right.
So why does Genesis 1:26 also sound non-monotheistic?
Very good. Excellent
There's
question.
the we.
Good.
And there's always,
But why? What is that?
Let us create humanity in our image. What does that say about God's character?
Well, from a Christian standpoint, we believe that God, from the beginning, was in community with the Son and the Spirit, and therefore creation is communal, and that's why man cannot live alone by himself. He needs a helper fit for him.
God is inherently relational. Yep. That's right. That's right. Now you can go back to the sort of the Near Eastern perception perhaps, where there is a divine council. But I agree with Bill. The key to this is that God is inherently communal and relational. What must, and which I think ties to the emotional element, right? Love demands community. As much as I love myself, it's not real love until it's expressed toward the other. Okay, this is Bruner's big point. It's that arrow. Christianity is set apart from pantheism. In pantheism, everything is God, right? According to the Christian tradition, according to the Jewish tradition, the chair is not God, the marker's not God, the whiteboard's not God, and believe it or not, I am not God, yes? So what must God do for creation to exist apart from God? Does this make sense? If we assume that God is all things and everywhere before creation, what must God do for creation to exist that is not God?
Create other things.
Create other things. And what does that do to God's being? If God is originally all things everywhere, what does that God do to God's being? This is really threatening to kind of pretty philosophical constructs. Even Augustine wrestles with this. What must God do for me to exist who is not God?
Develop community.
Yes, develop community.
Well, he blows into you the breath of life, which means that he has imbued you with some of the divine spirit.
Certainly, yeah.
And ability to create also.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's exactly right.
And he has given you dominion, which is a big question. What's that mean?
Yes.
But really simply creating animals and women. And well, yeah, there's a lot of creating the other
Yes.
going on.
That's exactly right. And this is what Bruner says. He says, in order for God to create that thing which is not God, God must create space for that and limit the divine self. Makes sense? It's a powerful concept if we think about it. God freely limits the divine self to make space for others. Yeah? Which challenges me, especially with my children, who wants to impose myself, right? Who wants to impose myself or others, or people who do not agree with me, people who do not see reality like me. I want to impose myself on those people.
But then we believe that God is sovereign.
Yes,
So we
limited.
know that he can change.
that's true. And so
So when he limits, it isn't necessarily limiting because he still has unlimited power.
correct. What is limiting? Why limit oneself?
To develop the other.
That's exactly right. To develop the other. Because it's demanded for relationship, community.
It introduces love.
Mhm.
Right, that good thing on Valentine's Day.
That's exactly
I
right.
gave a little-
That's why it's so important.
The most important holiday in our calendar.
And so this makes, and you know this, right? You know this in the deepest parts of your heart. You know this, the way you interact with people. If you don't limit yourself, I talk about my children. If I think I know everything and what is always best for them, they will not develop the way they should. Right? I have to be able to set myself aside and say,
And
who are
still-
you?
They need boundaries.
And they still need boundaries. That's exactly right. And as they get older and wiser, I need to limit myself more and more and more. Those boundaries are there to help them develop.
And then they can set their own boundaries.
Right.
That's the whole.
That's
Key
exactly
life.
right. So I probably won't have them call me every night when they're in college.
They
to
might
tell me
though.
they've made curfew, right?
So after we hear his sermon on this topic, we're gonna bring up all kinds of more questions that will continue this part. And I'm moving us because I have to be someplace, I usually say at 9:30, but it's fine. Else for a minute, and I need to leave. And if he wants to continue and talk, I'm sure we can do that.
Okay, really quick, David.
Mm.
Creativity. This is what I propose the image of God is, right? One who freely self-limits, or the process of freely self-limiting for the purpose of relationship. When that happens, creativity in life always emerges. And we see this at the end. God created humanity in God's own image, male and female, God creates humanity, which implies, what about the image?
In the image of God,
What's that?
through the Holy
Oops, that's
Spirit.
wrong. The divine image consists of the relationship between two or more people. That is to say, the individual does not possess the image of God within themselves. God is only imaged when two or more people freely self-limit to engage in relationship. And when that happens, creativity always emerges. This is Matthew 18:20, when Jesus says, when two or more are gathered in my name or my character, there I am with them. Oh, what I'm saying? That's the proposal. So as you pointed out, Bill, when man was alone in Genesis 2, and God said there's a problem with that because that loneliness did not fully image the divine.
But the problem with all of this is once you have done that, you have allowed your children to screw up. And when you have a relationship, you also create the possibility of anger and animosity and murder.
That's right. And that always happens when people are not limiting themselves for the benefit of the relationship. Animosity, murder, whatever you want to
But
put
why
in
do you allow that to happen, God? Why do you allow war? Why do you allow people to die of all these things?
Because I'd much rather have a relationship with my sons than control my sons.
But we still want God, to solve all these problems.
Yeah. And here's what God would say, then do it. Pursue my image. You have intention, you have free will.
It's interesting that in the debate about same-sex marriage, they go back to the image of God, said male and female. But you're saying something much more profound beyond that kind of relationship. You're talking about relationship with, there's a,
Argue, I'm saying. They only use, the authors are using male and female because it's a duality. It's like the opposite pairs. It's the best thing they could come up with. If we were to rewrite this in our contemporary context, it would be, and God created humanity in God's own image. Republican and Democrat, God created them.
or Rick and Dave.
Or Rick and Dave, whatever, yes. But whatever that opposing thing is.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, David. Thoughts? Questions?
Or we could say God created them all Republicans, but some went astray and became Democrats.
There you go.
Or the other way.
Or the other way. Or what I'll say in the sermon today is God created them all Chiefs fans and then someone astray and became Denver fans.
That'll get you some points.
That will get some points.
Sharp ones.